So the leaders of South Korea and Japan will meet this afternoon. Now, for more on what to expect from the meeting, we're joined today by Robertkelli, Professor of International Relations at Pusan National University. Professor Kelly, thanks for joining us this morning.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So a lot of attention is on whether historic issues like the Chosei coal mine will be on the agenda in today's meeting. How might the EU administration's approach to historical issues differ from that of the former Yoon administration?
Sure. I think most of the historical issues will probably not be brought up, except if there's something particularly salient to President Lee's coalition in South Korea, perhaps the comfort women, for example. That's a sort of well-known issue. But my sense is that both sides understand, and I think a lot of observers expect, that many of these issues have been gone over and over and over many times, and that bringing them back up is really not going to lead to very much. These issues have been debated between Korea now going on 35 years, and there's just not been a great deal of progress. And in an era where China's sort of behavior is becoming more difficult in the region, say regarding Taiwan, where the Americans are increasingly unreliable under Donald Trump, my own guess is that even if President Lee's coalition inside Korea would like these issues discussed, my sense is the strategic pressure will probably encourage the Koreans not to bring them up. And of course, the Japanese don't really want to talk about them at all. So my guess is the historical issues will be sidelined in the interest of some bland communique where, we're working on these things and we hope the historians can work it out. But I would be really surprised if there's any kind of meaningful discussions or big in-depth discussion of it, much less any kind of breakthrough. And as you said, in part, that's because of the way these things have been handled in the past by previous administrations. The Yoon government, I think, was, willing to kind of look the other way. But of course, the previous presidency, Moon Jae-in, right? Moon Jae-in, this became a huge issue, right? And the relationship really cratered for a while. And so my guess is that President Lee would like to avoid that.
I see. And what about security matters? How do you expect the talks to unfold on security issues?
Yeah, this is really tricky because the Chinese, of course, were just talking to President Lee last week and saying, don't get too close to the Americans and Japanese, right? I mean, that's sort of what the Chinese have been telling the South Koreans for years, right? That South Korea can avoid a sort of hegemonic clash between America and China if it kind of keeps quiet and kind of stays out of the way. And I think there's a certain amount of appeal to that, particularly in President Lee's coalition. There's kind of a desire to avoid getting swept up into this larger conflict between the Americans and the Chinese and Japanese, of course, be in the American camp. But on the other hand, right, I mean, the Americans are increasingly unreliable. And if the Americans under Donald Trump sort of pull out of East Asia, or if the Americans signal that, our word just isn't as reliable as it was before, that puts a lot of pressure on South Korea and Japan to cooperate because they live right next to China. They live right next to North Korea and Russia. Those three countries are all cooperating increasingly, right? We're very concerned that Russia, for example, is helping North Korea with missile technology. And so there are a lot of structural pressures on the Koreans and the Japanese to cooperate because they share a lot of values in democracy and liberalism and stuff like that, which very obviously China and the regional autocracies don't. And so I think this will probably push Korea and Japan, maybe against their will, maybe against the interests of some of their domestic coalitions, but I think it will push the two leaders towards some kind of joint statement about the importance of the status quo and not altering that with force.
And like you just mentioned, President Lee is in Japan just days after he returned from China. With tensions rising between Beijing and Tokyo, how should South Korea sort of balance relations with these two countries?
Well, the short-term answer, I think, is what you're kind of seeing from the Lee administration, which is that kind of keeping their head down, right? I think President Lee just said a couple days ago on Twitter or something like that, right, that South Korea has no permanent friends and enemies, has permanent interests, and we're sort of pursuing the national interest regardless of with whom we interact. And that'll work in the short term, particularly to keep the Chinese happy. But in the long term, I would argue that South Korea is actually threatened by a rise by autocratic China to dominance in the region. Japan really wants to block that. I would argue that's also in South Korea's interest. I realize that's an issue of debate inside South Korea, but I would argue that it's in South Korea's interest not to have a hegemonic China on its doorstep. And so ultimately that means that South Korea and Japan probably have to work together to block that outcome. And that's something I think the South Koreans are trying to dance around because South Korea exports a great deal to China. But the more the Chinese push on the region, particularly if they move on Taiwan, the harder it's going to be for South Korea to avoid this question, right? And I think that I would argue that this is probably the big grand strategy for South Korea in the next 2 decades, right? How is it going to respond to rising Chinese power? And I just don't know where South Korea will come down on that.
I see. And analysts say that today's summit could be a key moment for regional ties amid U.S. China rivalry. What's your take on this, and how do you see trilateral cooperation between the United States, Japan, and South Korea developing throughout this year?
Yeah, the second question I think is a little bit easier. I think trilateral cooperation, which I would argue is a good thing, will be undermined by the unreliability of the United States as a partner. One thing that sort of I've often felt sort of as an American who works in East Asia is that East Asian elites, I think, miss just how disinterested Donald Trump is in alliances, just how, I would argue, even destructive Donald Trump is regarding U.S. alliances. I think you can really see that, for example, in Europe regarding NATO and the Ukraine conflict. And I am very concerned that Donald Trump will bring those attitudes towards East Asia, that he just is not willing to fight for Taiwan, that he just doesn't really care about the U.S. and South Korea alliance. He's just not going to put in the kind of effort that you saw Joe Biden make, for example. And so I think trilateral will probably, very little will come of it, in part because the Americans just won't bother. And that will leave it to the South Koreans and the Japanese to work on this issue together. And traditionally, it's been very hard without the United States around to broker it. The only sort of upside, I suppose, the only thing sort of pushing in the other direction is that the more China comes to dominate the entire regional security discussion in East Asia, the more Korea and Japan are going to face really powerful pressures to work together. And I think this is, again, this I would argue is the big issue for Korea in the next couple decades. China is big, it's getting bigger, it's on South Korea's doorstep, it's an autocracy, it looks like it has imperialist designs at the very least on Taiwan, right? We know China's sort of misbehaving in the Yellow Sea. And so I think this is going to put a lot of pressure on South Korea eventually to kind of bury the hatchet with Japan and work together. It's going to take a while to get there, but I think that's where China is pushing the two of them.
I see. All right, Professor Kelly, thank you so much for your time and insight today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.